Thank you so much for tuning in to Morning Live. Now, the recent international conference held in Stellenbosch on recognition, reparation and reconciliation examined the political turbulence and also the intergenerational struggles that are playing out in post-apartheid South Africa, and of course also takes into cognizance the raging debates in Australia and other parts of the world. In Australia, about the failure of their constitution, for example, to recognize the rights of Aboriginal Australians. And this is, of course, a South African initiative intended to gauge how some of our counterparts the world over have actually managed to reach the stage of reconciliation in the aftermath of woundedness. Now, with South Africans still grappling with understanding the roles of victims and perpetrators, and especially given our violent past, the conference was aimed at understanding the transgenerational repercussions of trauma across the globe and also looking at how other nations have dealt with similar circumstances. And joining me right now is Lindiwe Hani, who's the daughter of slain struggle icon and Communist Party leader Chris Hani, and she, of course, is the author of the book Being Chris Hani's Daughter, and was also one of the participants at this particular conference. Lindiwe, good to see you again. Thanks for coming through.
Thanks for having me.
So do tell me, as a participant at this conference, firstly, what were your thoughts going into it, given that it deals with quite heavy subject matter, such as reconciliation?
Yes, well, I was invited by Dr. Phumla Gobodo-Madikizela for us to be in conversation so I can share my story regarding when I went to meet Janusz Walush and Clive Derby-Lewis. So I was very fortunate enough to sit in some of the panels. And when I went in, I was very interested and very curious, because it's international, to see how the other parts of the world have dealt with the reconciliation, recognition and reparations, to see what South Africa may or may not be doing wrong and what we can learn. And what I got from being a listener more than the participant was that it's still an ongoing struggle all over the world. I'm yet to find one country that has gotten it right, which is very, very interesting. And the other part that I found very curious was that the stories of the indigenous people of these different countries are still being told by other people. There was a very small representation of the indigenous people of different countries telling their own stories, which perturbed me, because I feel like we don't own our own history and we don't own our own stories, or unless we're not being given the platforms to share our side of the story. So it's still being told by third parties, which I find a bit difficult to comprehend.
Did you factor why this may be the case? Why is it that people, Aboriginal people, are still not telling their own stories?
Well, I do know that now a few people are telling their stories in Australia, but I think people are not afforded the platforms, or they're not given the exposure or the chance to. I mean, I cannot speak for other countries, but I know that in South Africa, we are still, even in South Africa, other people are still telling, let's say, African stories and black people's history, as opposed to black people telling our own history.
So we've just celebrated a Reconciliation Day here in South Africa, and just looking at the sort of activities that people participated in, what's your take on it? And how do you think, we could do better in that space of forging reconciliation as a nation?
Well, I feel like a lot of holidays in South Africa that are meant to have historical context fall flat. I mean, for people, it's just a public holiday for them to relax. And I actually have an issue with the term reconciliation, because it means we are reconciled at some point. And I don't think that was the case. So for us, and it feels like a forced gathering, or we must consider reconciliation at this time. But we do it without doing the first part, which is recognition. We can never go to reconciliation until there has been some form of recognition about the atrocities of the past, which I think it's something that has lacked in the South African context as well.
And I think you're making a few very profound points, but let's start with recognition. Mm-hmm. We had the TRC process that was hailed the world over, and yet people are still not satisfied within themselves. We seemingly as a nation are still not, satisfied with how that process played out, and perhaps it didn't have the intended consequence in delivering us to a space where we do feel, as you say, that we can reconcile and move on. But as someone whose family was almost, at the center of this because of the high profile nature of who your dad was and his assassination, do you feel any sort of burden, when it comes to something like reconciliation, that you need to perhaps as a family lead the way almost?
No, I mean, first let me deal with the TRC. I think the intention was good, but I think that the people who went into the TRC were doing it for their own personal reasons, in order maybe to avoid going to prison, avoid being persecuted. So I believe that if you go into it without pure intentions of getting to the truth, it will not have an impact. And I feel that it didn't have an impact. It was a good idea and maybe to bring us together, but once again, it was forced, and I think it also happened a bit too soon. The wounds were very, very raw, and I know that in my case especially, it just had happened. So it was very raw. I mean, the court case and TRC were very close together. In terms of the burden to reconcile, no. I mean, I felt other burdens. I mean, it's in my book of being Chris Hani's daughter. But the reconciliation part, I've never felt it. When I went on the journey to see Janusz Walush, I didn't have reconciliation in the back of my mind,
What were you thinking?
It was for closure. I lived so many years with him being a monster in my life. And I felt that he had all the power, because everything was guided by my hatred of him, because he had destroyed our family for all intents and purposes. So I was really angry, bitter, and I realized that emotional state was not good for me in my life and my journey. So when I went to see him, I didn't actually know why, but all I knew is that I wanted to meet him from the first time that it happened. It was always part of my plan, but due to the journey I went to with the drugs and the alcohol, I was never in the right mental state.
Did your family support your decision to go and meet with Janusz Walush?
50-50. I think my family more supported my personal journey of health, and when I insisted that this was part of me becoming more well and a better person, especially as a recovering addict, that's what they supported. They were not necessarily, cheerleading this endeavor of me meeting these two men, but my health was more important to them, so they got on board and they supported it from their perspective.
And your first impressions when you met them?
Different impressions. With Clive, my impression was that he was still very much full of excuses, Everything was justified. He had to do this because of certain reasons. Certain decisions by political leaders led him to make this decision, which I had a problem with because it reeks lack of accountability for your part in the assassination. With Janusz, he owned his part immediately, and he was very much a matter of fact, which I appreciated. And then until he got into saying how he felt about what he had done to my father, And with him, it was I felt more of a genuine interaction, because he wasn't apologetic about his beliefs, which I appreciate, because if he was apologetic, then it just wouldn't be genuine. So that interaction felt more genuine to me, and I took it on board better. So after leaving Janusz the first time I met him, I felt less burdened, I felt that I could breathe easier. And it doesn't mean that I walked out of prison and I had forgiven him.
But just a final one on that, having had that experience. So the clear acknowledgement that we also struggle with as victims and perpetrators, did it help you in understanding those roles better? And did it help you on your journey to perhaps reconciling what had happened?
Well, the way that it helped me is that from the traditional term of victim and perpetrator, is that when I left that interaction with Janusz, I walked out feeling that now I have control and the power has shifted, because I took back control of this interaction and the conversation going forward. So there I felt that I had began on the road to healing. And I mean, that's why I always say to people, it's not, for me, it's not as black and white as hatred or forgiveness. I haven't forgiven Janusz. I'm not even sure if I ever will forgive him. But what I have done is I've acknowledged what he had to say to me. I've acknowledged his apology and I've taken it on board. And what I've chosen to do is just let it go and move on. And that is the difference. There are days when I am full of grief. There are days when I'm full of anger. And there are days when I'm okay. There are days when I think of Janusz in a kind of affectionate way, and there are days I think he's a monster. And I think that is human nature, you know? It is a journey.
Absolutely. Lindiwe, thanks so much for sharing that with us. And I think this speaks to just how intensely personal this road to reconciliation is. And it's different for every person, and you've got to take it in your stride. But thanks to Lindiwe Hani, who is the daughter of Chris Hani, discussing perhaps a part of South Africa's state of reconciliation, speaking from personal experience after the death of her father, the slain struggle icon and Communist Party leader, Chris Hani. We're going to take a break, and on the other side of that, we'll have the latest news.
On Media Monitor, we leave no stone